In 1833, Britain abolished slavery across its empire. On paper, the chains were broken, but in the plantations something simply went quiet. When the Slavery Abolition Act passed in 1833, it was celebrated as a moral turning point in British history. Speeches echoed through Parliament about justice, humanity, and progress. Newspapers praised the decision as the end of a brutal era. Across the Caribbean and other colonial territories, the law declared that enslaved men and women were now legally free. The empire congratulated itself. But laws written in London did not instantly transform the soil of distant plantations. Freedom, as defined by ink and signatures, did not automatically dismantle systems built over generations. The transition was not immediate emancipation in practice. Instead, Britain introduced what it called the apprenticeship system. Formerly enslaved people were required to continue working for their former owners for a fixed number of years, supposedly to prepare them for full freedom. Wages were minimal or non-existent. Mobility remained restricted. Discipline remained harsh. To outside observers, slavery had ended. In the fields, routines changed very little. The terminology shifted. The labor continued. Plantation owners received financial compensation from the British government for the loss of their human property. Enslaved received nothing. This detail is often mentioned in economic records but rarely examined emotionally. The state acknowledged loss not in the suffering of those who had been enslaved, but in the financial disruption faced by those who had profited from them. Millions of pounds were distributed to former slave owners. The freed population was left to navigate a new world without land, capital, or institutional support. In the years following abolition, something else began to happen. Plantation ledgers changed format. Language within records shifted from slave inventories to labor contracts. Names that once appeared on the ownership columns began to disappear or reappear as anonymous entries tied to debts and obligations. Some archives from certain estates are incomplete. Others show sudden gaps in documentation during the transitional period. Fires, floods, mismanagement, and neglect are often cited as reasons for missing records. Yet historians continue to debate why documentation in some regions becomes unusually thin precisely when legal status changed. Formerly enslaved individuals often found themselves bound by new economic constraints. Without access to land, many had little choice but to remain on the same plantations where they had labored before. Contracts replaced chains, but dependency remained. Wages were structured in ways that kept workers indebted. Housing was tied to employment. Leaving could mean homelessness or starvation. The system adapted. It became quieter, more administrative, less visibly violent perhaps, but still deeply unequal. Across parts of the British Caribbean, resistance continued. Workers protested unfair contracts. They challenged abusive overseers. Some attempted to establish independent villages away from plantation control. Colonial authorities frequently intervened when labor shortages threatened profits. Laws regarding vagrancy and loitering were enforced in ways that pressured free populations back into plantation work. Freedom existed within boundaries carefully managed by those who still controlled land and capital. As decades passed, the narrative of abolition simplified. Textbooks framed 1833 as a clean moral break from the past. Britain positioned itself as a leader in humanitarian reform. Yet beneath that narrative were quieter continuities. The global demand for sugar, cotton, and other plantation crops did not disappear. Profits remained essential to imperial economics. When one labor system ended, alternatives emerged. Indentured laborers from India and other regions were transported to colonies under contracts that often mirrored earlier coercive structures. The faces in the fields changed. The hierarchy endured. The disappearance of certain plantation records complicates the story further. Some estates maintain detailed pre-abolition accounts but offer sparse documentation for the years immediately following emancipation. Scholars attribute this to administrative transitions, financial instability, or simple decay of paper archives in tropical climates. Still, the pattern invites questions. When systems transform under legal pressure, documentation sometimes becomes selective, not necessarily through conspiracy, but through convenience. What does it mean for slavery to end legally? Law can redefine status, but it cannot instantly redistribute power. It cannot erase debt structures. It cannot guarantee economic independence. In many former plantation societies, land ownership remained concentrated in the hands of a small elite long after abolition. Political authority often stayed aligned with economic power. Social hierarchies persisted even as the vocabulary changed. Over time, open coercion became less visible, replaced by contracts, credit systems, and legal frameworks that appeared neutral on the surface. The brutality of the whip was replaced by the pressure of debt. The auction block disappeared, but labor markets were tightly constrained. For many freed families, survival meant negotiating with the same estates that had once claimed ownership over their bodies. Freedom existed, but within limits shaped by history. The story of 1833 is not one of simple continuity, nor is it one of complete rupture. It is a story of transformation. Slavery as a legal institution ended within the British Empire. That fact is undeniable, but systems built over centuries do not dissolve overnight. They adjust, they reorganize, they rename themselves. Some records survive to tell us how, others are missing, leaving historians to piece together fragments. In the silence of those gaps, interpretation begins. Did plantation records quietly disappear, or were they merely lost to time? Did labor truly become free, or did it evolve into new forms of dependency? The answers are complex, layered, and uncomfortable. Abolition marked a moral milestone, yet it also marked the beginning of a long struggle over what freedom would actually mean in practice. By the late 19th century, the British Empire had reshaped its public identity. It portrayed itself as an opponent of the slave trade and a defender of liberty. Meanwhile, plantation economies continued to function, sustained by global markets and controlled land distribution. The visible chains were gone. The structures that replaced them were harder to see. History rarely moves in clean lines. It shifts in shadows as often as in declarations. In 1833, slavery ended legally, but on many plantations, life did not change as dramatically as the headlines suggested. And when records fade or vanish during moments of transition, what remains is not certainty, but silence. In the years immediately following 1833, the British Empire entered what officials described as a managed transition. The word freedom appeared frequently in speeches and printed declarations. Yet on the plantations, the daily rhythm of labor began each morning exactly as it had before. Fields still demanded cutting, boiling houses still required constant tending, and export ships still waited at harbors for cargo. The economic machine did not pause to reflect on morality. It required continuity, and so continuity was quietly engineered. The apprenticeship system became the bridge between slavery and what was promised as full liberty. Formerly enslaved people were reclassified as apprentices and were legally obligated to provide unpaid labor for a significant portion of each week. Plantation owners justified this as necessary discipline and training. Officials in Britain framed it as a compromise between humanitarian reform and economic stability. In practice, many apprentices reported conditions nearly indistinguishable from the past. Punishments continued under new legal categories. Movement remained restricted. Authority structures were barely altered. When apprenticeship was finally terminated earlier than originally planned due to mounting criticism, a new phase began. Formerly enslaved individuals were now technically free laborers. Yet freedom without land created a trap. Plantation estates controlled most arable territory. Access to housing was often tied to employment contracts. Wages were deliberately kept low in many colonies to ensure that laborers could not easily accumulate savings or purchase property. If a worker refused plantation terms, there were few alternatives available. The law no longer declared ownership of bodies, but economic dependency accomplished a similar outcome. During this transitional era, plantation bookkeeping practices evolved. Where previous ledgers had itemized enslaved individuals as property assets, new records categorized labor under wages, advances, and penalties. Debt entries became common. Tools, clothing, and even basic supplies were sometimes deducted from pay. Workers who attempted to leave before settling alleged debts could face legal consequences. The visible structure of slavery had dissolved, yet paper mechanisms emerged that bound labor through financial obligation rather than legal ownership. Colonial governments introduced vagrancy laws and contract enforcement measures that disproportionately targeted the newly freed population. A person without formal employment could be fined or imprisoned. In effect, remaining within plantation systems became the safest option for survival. The rhetoric of liberty existed alongside regulations that limited autonomy. The contradiction was rarely acknowledged in official reports, which emphasized order and productivity over lived experience. Another significant development was the recruitment of indentured laborers from other parts of the empire, particularly from India. These laborers signed contracts that promised wages and eventual return passage, but many faced harsh conditions, cultural isolation, and restrictive oversight upon arrival. Plantation owners argued that this system was voluntary and legally distinct from slavery. Critics observed that the power imbalance and limited mobility echoed earlier patterns. The workforce composition shifted, but the plantation hierarchy endured. Economic data from the mid-19th century reveals that sugar and other plantation exports remained vital to imperial trade. Investors in London and other financial centers had strong incentives to preserve output levels. Compensation payments made to former slave owners were often reinvested into industrial ventures or estate modernization. Meanwhile, freed communities struggled to secure resources for independent farming or business development. Access to credit was limited. Political representation was restricted. The gap between legal freedom and economic empowerment widened. In some regions, freed people pooled resources to purchase small plots of land collectively, forming villages beyond direct plantation control. These efforts represented genuine attempts to redefine freedom on their own terms. Yet such communities frequently faced pressure through taxation policies, infrastructure neglect, or market barriers that made economic independence difficult. Plantation elites retained influence within colonial assemblies, shaping policies that protected their interests. The disappearance or fragmentation of certain estate records during these decades complicates reconstruction of the full picture. Tropical climates damaged archives. Financial reorganizations led to lost paperwork. Ownership transfers sometimes resulted in selective preservation of documents deemed economically relevant. Whether through negligence or design, the historical trail becomes uneven precisely at the moment when labor systems transformed. Historians rely on court cases, personal letters, and scattered administrative reports to fill the gaps. These fragments suggest continuity beneath the surface of reform. By the latter half of the 19th century, the language surrounding plantation labor had fully shifted. Terms such as productivity, efficiency, and contract compliance replaced earlier vocabulary of ownership. To outside observers, especially in Britain, the empire appeared aligned with liberal progress. Public memory condensed abolition into a moral victory, often overlooking the complex restructuring that followed. The plantations no longer operated under the name of slavery, yet they continued to rely on tightly controlled labor forces shaped by unequal access to land and capital. Section 2 of this story reveals that endings in law do not automatically produce endings in structure. The transformation after 1833 was real, but it was also strategic. Authority adapted to preserve economic stability, records changed format, systems adjusted language, and in that adjustment, the line between liberation and continuity blurred. As the 19th century progressed, the memory of slavery within the British Empire began to soften in public discourse. Abolition was increasingly framed as a defining moral achievement, proof that reform could triumph over exploitation. Anniversaries were commemorated. Political speeches invoked 1833 as a symbol of national conscience, yet far from Westminster, in the former plantation colonies, the legacy of the old system continued to shape daily life in ways that were less visible but deeply entrenched. Land ownership remained the central divide. Vast estates stayed in the hands of families who had profited under slavery. Compensation funds had stabilized their losses and, in some cases, strengthened their financial position. Freed communities, by contrast, rarely received redistribution. Without meaningful land reform, economic independence was limited. Many families cultivated small provision grounds or rented marginal plots, but prime agricultural land remained consolidated. Generations grew up navigating a labor market structured around estates that had merely changed their legal vocabulary. Court records from the mid to late 19th century revealed a steady flow of disputes involving wages, contract breaches, and alleged debts. Formerly enslaved workers who challenged plantation terms often found themselves confronting magistrates drawn from the same social class as estate owners. Legal equality existed in theory, yet enforcement mechanisms favored those with resources and influence. The absence of overt change did not eliminate imbalance, it refined it. Education and political participation followed similar patterns. Access to schooling was inconsistent and frequently underfunded. Voting rights in many colonies were tied to property qualifications that excluded much of the freed population. Power remained concentrated. Economic leverage translated into legislative authority. The plantation system had been legally dismantled, but its leadership networks endured within colonial governance structures. Meanwhile, imperial trade expanded. Sugar markets fluctuated, competition intensified, and industrialization in Britain accelerated. Plantation economies adapted to global pressures by restructuring labor agreements and experimenting with mechanization where possible. When profitability declined, wages were often the first variable adjusted. Workers bore the brunt of market downturns. The language of freedom did little to shield them from economic volatility, shaped by distant investors and policymakers. In historical archives, researchers sometimes encounter gaps in documentation during moments of unrest. Labor strikes, protests over wages, or clashes with colonial authorities are referenced briefly, then fade from official correspondence. Local newspapers occasionally preserve more candid accounts, though these too were influenced by editorial bias. Oral histories collected generations later speak of intimidation, blacklisting, and quiet reprisals against those who resisted unfair conditions. These narratives are difficult to quantify, yet they persist across regions with striking similarity. Over time, the empire's self-image continued to emphasize its role in ending slavery worldwide, particularly through naval patrols aimed at suppressing the transatlantic slave trade. This external focus reinforced a narrative of moral leadership. Internally, however, former plantation societies wrestled with unresolved inequalities rooted in centuries of coerced labor. Infrastructure investment often prioritized export efficiency over community development. Roads led from fields to ports, not from villages to schools. By the early 20th century, some colonies began to push more forcefully for political reform and labor rights. Organized movements emerged, demanding fair wages, representation, and social services. These campaigns highlighted the unfinished nature of emancipation. They argued that legal abolition had been only the first step in a longer struggle for substantive freedom. Resistance no longer took the form of plantation revolts alone, but of unions, petitions, and public demonstrations. The story of what followed 1833 is therefore neither a simple continuation of slavery nor a clean break from it. It is a story of adaptation. Power recalibrated itself through contracts, credit systems, property law, and political control. Freedom became a status recognized in statute books, yet its depth depended heavily on access to land, education, and economic opportunity. Where those remained restricted, the shadows of the plantation stretched forward into new eras. When historians examine the period, they often rely on fragmented archives, financial ledgers, court transcripts, and scattered personal letters. The silence within certain record sets does not necessarily prove deliberate erasure, but it does remind us that transitions of power are rarely documented in ways that expose every continuity. What disappears from official files can sometimes survive in patterns of inequality that persist long after headlines fade. By the time the British Empire began to dissolve in the 20th century, many former plantation territories carried with them social and economic structures shaped during that ambiguous post-abolition period. The chains had been removed from law, yet the architecture of dependence had evolved rather than vanished. Section 3 reveals that emancipation was an event, but transformation was a process still unfolding long after 1833 had been celebrated as an ending. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the world had largely accepted a simplified version of events. Britain had abolished slavery in 1833. The empire had corrected a moral wrong. The story, as it was often told, had a clear beginning and a triumphant end. Yet in the former plantation colonies, daily life told a more complicated truth. Inequality had not disappeared. It had matured. Economic structures built during slavery continued to shape opportunity. Wealth accumulated by plantation families flowed into banks, railways, factories, and political institutions. Capital moved forward, carrying with it the benefits of generations of unpaid labor. Freed families, meanwhile, often began with nothing but their resilience. The imbalance created under slavery did not reset at abolition. It carried forward, compounding across decades. In many regions, land ownership patterns established before 1833 remained largely intact well into the 20th century. Large estates dominated the best agricultural areas. Former plantation owners or their descendants maintained influence in commerce and governance. Even where political reforms eventually expanded voting rights, economic leverage still shaped outcomes. Freedom existed, but it existed inside boundaries drawn long before emancipation. The archival silence that surrounds certain transitions continues to challenge historians. Missing estate papers, incomplete wage books, gaps in correspondence during moments of unrest. Some losses can be explained by climate, neglect, or routine administrative turnover. Others remain uncertain. What is clear is that records alone rarely capture the full reality of lived experience. Power often documents itself selectively. Absence does not always mean conspiracy, but it does mean that parts of the story must be reconstructed from fragments. Over generations, new systems replaced old terminology. Debt peonage, restrictive labor contracts, limited access to credit, and discriminatory enforcement of law shaped economic life in ways less visible than chains but still constraining. The brutality of ownership gave way to the pressure of scarcity. Violence did not vanish entirely, but it no longer needed to be constant to maintain hierarchy. Structural imbalance performed much of the work. As the 20th century advanced, former colonies began to assert greater autonomy. Independence movements reframed national identity and re-examined colonial legacies. Scholars revisited plantation archives, tracing how compensation payments, land policies, and financial networks had influenced development. Public debates emerged over restitution, memory, and accountability. The end of slavery was no longer treated as a closed chapter, but as the beginning of a longer reckoning. The phrase slavery ended legally is accurate. The institution defined by ownership of human beings was dismantled within the British Empire. That achievement remains historically significant. But legality and lived reality are not always synchronized. Systems of exploitation can dissolve in statute while persisting in structure. They adapt to survive within new rules. What happened after 1833 was not a secret continuation of slavery in its original form. It was a transformation shaped by economics, law, and power. Some injustices were confronted. Others were absorbed into emerging systems that appeared neutral on the surface. The disappearance of certain plantation records may reflect ordinary archival loss, yet the patterns of inequality that followed suggest that change was uneven and incomplete. History rarely offers clean endings. It moves through phases, each influenced by what came before. Abolition marked a profound shift in moral language and legal status. It did not automatically equalize wealth, redistribute land, or dismantle hierarchy. Those tasks required generations of struggle, reform, and resistance. In the quiet after celebration, plantations did not simply vanish. They evolved. The chains were removed from law books. The fields remained, and in that space between proclamation and practice, the true complexity of freedom unfolded. By the time the modern era began to examine the legacy of empire with greater scrutiny, the distance from 1833 had created a comfortable myth. Abolition was remembered as a decisive moral correction, a moment when conscience overcame commerce. Yet when economists, archivists, and social historians began tracing the long arc of wealth, land, and institutional power, they found lines that did not break cleanly at emancipation. They continued. Compensation payments issued to former slave owners did not disappear into history. Many were invested into railways, banking institutions, shipping companies, and early industrial ventures. Family fortunes that originated in plantation labor quietly merged into the financial architecture of the 19th and 20th centuries. The beneficiaries of those payments often left detailed financial records, while the descendants of the enslaved navigated systems that documented them far less generously. The imbalance of documentation mirrored the imbalance of capital across former plantation colonies. Patterns of limited land access and economic dependency shaped development trajectories long after slavery's legal end. In some territories, monocrop economies remained dominant, making local populations vulnerable to global price swings. Infrastructure built during the colonial era prioritized export routes rather than internal connectivity. The structure of opportunity had been designed around extraction, and redesigning it required political power that was slow to arrive. When researchers attempt to reconstruct individual lives from the decades after abolition, they often encounter gaps. Names that appear consistently in slave registers sometimes become harder to trace in wage records. Entire communities are visible in census data only intermittently. Migration, informal labor arrangements, and incomplete archives obscure continuity. Silence in the record does not erase existence, but it complicates recovery. The disappearance of paperwork can soften the visibility of hardship. In the 20th century, as independence movements gained momentum, activists reframed emancipation as an unfinished promise. They argued that legal freedom without structural equity left deeper wounds unresolved. Debates over land reform, education access, labor rights, and political representation drew direct lines back to plantation systems. The conversation shifted from whether slavery had ended to how its consequences persisted. Modern scholarship approaches this history with nuance. Few serious historians claim that slavery secretly continued unchanged after 1833. The institution defined by ownership was dismantled, yet they also recognize that exploitation can survive within new legal frameworks. Systems built on inequality do not collapse automatically when terminology changes. They require deliberate restructuring. The idea that plantation records quietly disappeared speaks less to a hidden conspiracy and more to the fragile nature of historical memory. Archives are shaped by what institutions choose to preserve. Financial documents tied to wealth tend to survive. Everyday records of marginalized communities are more vulnerable to loss. Over time, this imbalance influences how stories are told and which experiences remain visible. As the 21st century grapples with questions of restitution and historical accountability, the period after abolition receives renewed attention. Researchers analyze compensation archives, track investment patterns, and examine how colonial labor systems influence global economic networks. The past is no longer confined to dusty volumes. It echoes in present disparities, in property maps, in generational wealth statistics. The ending of slavery in 1833 was real and transformative. It altered legal identity and dismantled an openly brutal institution. But endings in law are not endings in consequence. What followed was a reconfiguration of power that unfolded quietly, often bureaucratically, sometimes invisibly. Contracts replaced ownership. Debt replaced chains. Opportunity remained uneven. History's final chapter on slavery has not been written because its legacy continues to shape societies long after emancipation. The plantations did not vanish overnight. They adapted, declined, or transformed according to economic pressure and political change. The silence that followed abolition was not emptiness. It was the sound of a system learning how to survive within new rules. And so the story does not close with celebration alone. It closes with a question that stretches forward in time. When a system built on inequality ends legally, how long does it take for equality to become real?